Long before Paris became a city of boulevards, cafes, and glowing lights, this place was something entirely different. 2,000 years ago, the valley of the Seine was wild. Dense forests stretched across the land. Fog rolled slowly above the river in the mornings, and the only sounds were wind in the trees and water moving through the reeds. In the middle of the river stood a small island. Today, we know it as Ile de la Cité, the very heart of Paris. But in the 3rd century before Christ, it was just a rough patch of land surrounded by water. No stone bridges, no cathedrals, no grand buildings, only a small tribal settlement. The people who lived here were a Celtic tribe called the Parisii. They were river people, fishermen who knew every bend of the Seine, traders who moved goods between tribes, craftsmen who shaped metal, wood, and leather into tools for survival. Their homes were simple circular huts, made of timber and clay with thick roofs of straw. Smoke from cooking fires drifted slowly above the village. Life here followed the rhythm of the river. At dawn, fishermen pushed their narrow boats into the water. By midday, traders arrived from distant villages carrying grain, pottery, skins, and metal tools. And by evening, the small island settlement grew quiet again, surrounded by the endless forests of Gaul. It was not a large place, but it was an important one. The Seine was one of the great arteries of ancient Gaul. Boats traveling along the river carried goods across huge distances, and this small island controlled one of the safest crossings. Whoever controlled this point controlled trade. For generations, the Parisii lived here, watching the river flow past their homes. They had no way of knowing that their quiet settlement would one day grow into one of the most powerful cities in Europe. But far beyond these forests, another power was already expanding. An empire that built roads across continents. An empire that turned villages into cities. And that empire was moving closer, Rome. The quiet life of the Parisii tribe would not last forever. In the 1st century before Christ, a powerful force was expanding across Europe, Rome. Under the command of Julius Caesar, Roman legions pushed deep into the lands of Gaul. Their goal was simple: conquest, control, and the expansion of the Roman world. By 52 BC, the Roman army had reached the region of the Seine. For the tribes of Gaul, the arrival of Rome was unlike anything they had ever seen. Roman legions moved with terrifying discipline. Thousands of soldiers marched together in perfect formation, protected by shields, helmets, and iron weapons. They built roads through forests. They constructed camps overnight. And wherever they arrived, the world began to change. The Parisii tribe resisted Roman control. According to ancient accounts, when the Roman forces approached their settlement, the tribe made a desperate decision. Rather than allow the Romans to take the town, they burned it themselves. The small island settlement on the Seine was reduced to ash, but destruction was never the end of Rome's story. It was usually the beginning. After the conquest, the Romans rebuilt the settlement as a proper Roman town. They called it Lutetia. Unlike the tribal village that stood before it, Lutetia was carefully planned. Straight stone roads crossed the city. Markets appeared along the river. Bathhouses, temples, and public buildings rose from the ground. The Romans even built an amphitheater large enough to hold thousands of spectators. For the first time, this small island on the Seine became part of a vast empire stretching across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Roman merchants arrived. Roman soldiers patrolled the streets. Latin replaced the old tribal languages in administration and trade. For nearly 3 centuries, Lutetia thrived as a Roman town. But Rome itself was beginning to weaken. And as the empire slowly started to crack under pressure from invasions and internal chaos, the quiet city along the Seine would once again find itself on the edge of a new transformation. By the 5th century, the world that Rome had built was beginning to collapse. Across Europe, the old imperial order was breaking apart, and cities that had once thrived under Roman protection suddenly found themselves exposed. Lutetia, The quiet Roman town along the Seine was no longer protected by the legions that had once guarded the frontiers of the empire. Trade routes became dangerous, communication between regions slowed, and rumors of invading armies began spreading across the land. Entire regions of Europe were already falling to new powers, and among them was one of the most feared leaders the continent had ever seen, Attila the Hun. His armies moved across the plains of Europe like a storm. Cities burned in their path, armies were crushed, and entire populations fled long before his forces even arrived. By the year 451 AD, the news reached Lutetia. Attila was moving west, and fear spread quickly through the city. Families began gathering their belongings, merchants prepared to abandon their shops, and many believed the only way to survive was to flee before the Hun army appeared on the horizon. But in the middle of this growing panic, one voice began to stand out above the fear. A young woman named Genevieve. She was not a soldier, and she was not a ruler, but she possessed something far more powerful: conviction. According to later accounts, Genevieve urged the people of the city not to run. She warned them that abandoning their homes would only guarantee their destruction. Instead, she called on them to remain, to have faith, and to stand together. At first, many believed her words were impossible. How could a small city survive against the army of Attila? Yet, Genevieve continued speaking to the frightened population, and slowly, something unexpected began to happen. The panic began to fade. The people of Lutetia decided to stay. Whether it was faith, strategy, or simple coincidence, Attila's army never attacked the city. Lutetia was spared, and from that moment, Genevieve became more than just a citizen. She became the protector of the city, the woman who convinced Paris not to run. By the 9th century, the small city along the Seine had begun to grow again. Lutetia was no longer just a quiet Roman settlement. It had slowly transformed into a medieval city that people were beginning to call Paris. Wooden houses crowded the riverbanks. Narrow streets twisted between markets and workshops, and trade once again flowed along the Seine. But the river that brought wealth to the city also brought danger. From the north, across the cold waters of Scandinavia, a new kind of warrior had begun to appear across Europe. They arrived in long, narrow ships that could travel both across the open sea and deep inland along rivers. These warriors were known as the Vikings. Fast, ruthless, and unpredictable, Viking raiders had already attacked cities across England and the Frankish kingdoms. They moved quickly, striking towns before armies could gather to stop them. In the year 845, a massive Viking fleet sailed up the Seine River toward Paris. According to some chronicles, the fleet contained more than 100 longships filled with thousands of warriors. As the ships approached the city, panic spread through the population. The people of Paris had heard stories of Viking raids before. Villages burned, monasteries looted, entire settlements destroyed in a matter of hours. Now, those same ships were appearing on the horizon of their own river. The Viking leader, a chieftain known as Ragnar, led the fleet toward the city. His warriors moved swiftly along the riverbanks, attacking surrounding settlements and forcing the Frankish king, Charles the Bald, to respond. When the Viking army reached Paris, the city was not ready for a prolonged siege. The wooden defenses and small garrison could not withstand the full force of the raiders. Rather than risk the destruction of the city, the Frankish king made a desperate decision. He paid the Vikings an enormous ransom in silver to leave. The Viking fleet eventually withdrew down the Seine, carrying the treasure with them. Paris had survived the attack, but the lesson was clear. If the city wanted to endure, it would need stronger walls, stronger bridges, and stronger defenses. Because the Vikings would return again. 40 years after the first Viking raid, Paris had learned its lesson. The city knew the river was both its greatest advantage and its greatest vulnerability. The Seine connected Paris to the entire kingdom, but it also opened the gates to enemies who could sail straight into its heart. This time, Paris would not be caught unprepared. By the year 885, Viking raids had become a terrifying fact of life across Western Europe. Entire monasteries had been burned. Coastal towns had vanished overnight. Viking longships could appear anywhere, along the English coast, deep inside Frankish rivers, even hundreds of miles inland. Their ships were fast, shallow, and deadly, and the warriors who sailed them were feared across the continent. But in the autumn of 885, something far larger was coming. Scouts along the Seine began reporting an enormous fleet moving inland from the sea. At first, people refused to believe it. Then, more reports came. Dozens of ships, then hundreds. Soon, the truth became impossible to ignore. A Viking army was sailing directly toward Paris. According to chroniclers of the time, the fleet may have included more than 700 ships, carrying tens of thousands of warriors. Longships filled the river from bank to bank. Their carved dragon heads cut through the water as oars struck the surface in perfect rhythm. When the fleet finally appeared before Paris, the sight must have been overwhelming. But Paris was no longer defenseless. Two fortified bridges crossed the Seine, protected by massive towers and heavy gates. These bridges were the key to the city. If the Vikings controlled them, they could sail deeper into Frankish territory. But if Paris held the bridges, the Viking fleet would be trapped. The Viking leader demanded passage. The defenders refused, and so the siege began. Viking warriors launched attack after attack against the bridges. Arrows filled the sky. Battering rams slammed against the towers. Flaming projectiles crashed against the wooden defenses. But the defenders of Paris fought back with everything they had: boiling oil, stones, spears, fire. Day after day, the Viking assaults continued. But the bridges held. The siege dragged on for months. Winter arrived, bringing freezing winds and hunger to both armies. The Viking fleet surrounded the city, but they could not break through the defenses. The Parisians were exhausted, starving, and surrounded, yet they refused to surrender. Finally, after nearly a year of fighting, the Viking army withdrew. Paris had survived the largest Viking siege in its history, and this time, the city had not paid silver to save itself. It had fought and endured. The lesson of Paris was now clear to all of Europe. This city would not fall easily. After surviving the Viking sieges, Paris began to change. The city had proven it could endure war, and that reputation started to attract people. Traders came first, traveling the river routes that connected northern Europe to the Frankish lands. Then came craftsmen, builders, and scholars. Slowly, the small, fortified settlement on the Seine was transforming into one of the most important cities in medieval Europe. By the early 12th century, Paris had become a crowded and energetic place. Narrow streets wound between wooden houses and stone churches. Markets filled the air with the noise of bargaining merchants and the smell of bread, fish, and leather. Along the riverbanks, ships unloaded goods from distant regions: grain from the countryside, cloth from Flanders, wine from Burgundy. But the most dramatic transformation began in 1163. That year, construction started on a cathedral that would change the skyline of Paris forever: Notre-Dame. For the people of medieval Europe, cathedrals were more than religious buildings. They were statements of power, faith, and ambition. Notre-Dame was designed to be taller, brighter, and more magnificent than anything the city had ever seen. Thousands of craftsmen worked on the site: stonemasons carving massive blocks, carpenters raising wooden scaffolding, blacksmiths forging iron supports. The construction would take nearly 2 centuries. Huge cranes lifted stone high above the city. Flying buttresses stretched outward like giant arms supporting the cathedral walls. Colored glass windows filled the interior with light that medieval people believed represented the presence of God. While the cathedral slowly rose above the island in the Seine, another transformation was happening nearby. On the left bank, scholars began gathering to teach theology, philosophy, and law. These schools would eventually become the University of Paris, one of the most important centers of learning in medieval Europe. Students arrived from across the continent. They spoke Latin, debated ideas, and copied manuscripts by candlelight. The district where they lived became known as the Latin Quarter. By the 13th century, Paris had become more than a city. It was now a center of power, faith, and knowledge, a place where ideas could shape the future of Europe. And the skyline of the city, dominated by the rising towers of Notre-Dame, announced that transformation to the world. By the late 18th century, Paris had become the heart of France. The city was larger than it had ever been before, crowded with nearly 600,000 people. Elegant palaces and grand boulevards stood beside narrow streets, where the poor struggled to survive. While the aristocracy lived in luxury, ordinary Parisians faced rising prices, unemployment, and hunger. Bread, the most basic food in the city, had become painfully expensive. Long lines formed outside bakeries each morning as families waited for hours, hoping to buy a single loaf. Rumors of corruption and injustice spread through the crowded streets and cafes of the capital. The anger of the people was growing. In July of 1789, that anger finally exploded. Crowds began gathering across Paris, demanding weapons to defend themselves against the king's soldiers. Thousands of citizens armed themselves with whatever they could find: muskets, tools, even farming equipment. Their target soon became clear: the Bastille, a massive medieval fortress rising above the eastern edge of Paris. For decades, the Bastille had symbolized the absolute power of the monarchy. It was a prison where political enemies of the king could be locked away without trial. On the morning of July 14, 1789, an enormous crowd surrounded the fortress. At first, the demonstrators demanded gunpowder and weapons stored inside the Bastille. But tensions quickly escalated. Shots were fired. Chaos erupted. The crowd surged forward. For hours, the battle continued as smoke and gunfire filled the air. Finally, the defenders of the fortress surrendered. The gates of the Bastille were opened, and the crowd stormed inside. The fall of the Bastille shocked Europe. It was not just the capture of a prison. It was the moment when the people of Paris proved they could challenge the power of the king. The French Revolution had begun. In the years that followed, Paris would witness both hope and terror. The monarchy would fall. Kings and queens would face the guillotine, and the streets of the city would become the center of one of the most dramatic political transformations in human history. But everything started with that single day in July, when the people of Paris took the Bastille.